Well, I'm going to start, Dennis, for you, but we are really, really pleased to have with us Bob Lavigna. Uh, Dennis and Kurt and I have all known him for a long time, and he's been hard to get because he's so darn good at what he does. Um, he is with, as it says on the slide here, a senior fellow with the at UKG, which I'm going to ask you to tell us what that means. But he's only
Sure.
been there since August. But for the last 35 years, he has been a pro, an expert in HR, uh, all across, really around the globe. He's an award-winning public sector leader and innovator. He just joined UKG in this past summer. Prior to that, he had directed the Institute for Public Sector Employee Engagement. Did that for about 6 years, and then he taught at La Follette for a couple of years, which is great for the La Follette Public Policy School. Some of you may remember him as Assistant Vice Chancellor and Director of Human Resources for the university, and he did that for about 6 years. But others of you might remember his time with the state. For 10 years, he ran the director of the Wisconsin merit system. So whether or not we got raises or not, Bob, it might have been.
I was responsible for compensation, Terry.
Oh, sure. It sounds like that. But Bob was selected as the Public Official of the Year by Governing Magazine. He's an elected fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, and the list goes on and on. He has his bachelor's from George Washington and his master's from Cornell. And it's always a privilege, Bob, to see you and to tap into what you've been doing with HR and where the labor force is in the future, and take us on a trip.
Well, thanks, Terry. It's great to be with you, especially folks who I probably worked with during those, as Terry said, 35 years. It's actually more like 48 years, Terry, going back to my job with GAO. That was my first job right out of college for 17 years before we moved here to Wisconsin to become head of the civil service system. So it's been a long career. Recently, my shelf life is around 5 or 6 years, as Terry just described. So don't tell my current employer that. I now work, as Terry said, for UKG, which stands for the Ultimate Chronos Group. Some of you may know Chronos as a timekeeping software. A few years ago, we merged with the Ultimate Software, and we provide a complete suite of human capital management software. So if you're worried that I'm going to sell you something, don't, because I just told you everything I know about UKG that I've been able to pick up in 3 months. I have a lot to learn. But my job as senior fellow, it's a great job. My job is to write and speak primarily, like I'm doing today, and advocate for the public sector, for public servants, and for effective HR practices. So even though I'm in the marketing department at UKG, I'm not in a sales position. What I'm trying to do is continue to raise the awareness across the public sector, federal, state, and local, and higher education, public higher education, of the critical challenges that the public sector faces in attracting, developing, engaging, and retaining talent, which I always start these presentations by saying, I think that's the biggest challenge facing the public sector, federal, state, and local. Sometimes I get some funny looks and raised eyebrows. I hope today I'm preaching to the converted, because in government, we, and I continue to say we, because I've spent those 48 years in government, can't get anything done without talent, the right people with the right skills in the right places at the right times, have great ideas, sound policies, cutting edge technology, which is what we provide. But unless you have the talent to execute on that stuff, you can't be successful, especially in government, where talent is really the only resource. And of course, over the past 3 years, everything has been turned upside down. And government in particular faces a lot of challenges in attracting, developing, engaging, and retaining talent. So what I like to talk about is the new world of work, what the working environment looks like, and the implications of those changes for the public sector. Now, Terry originally asked me to talk about what's happening to current public sector employees. So I really don't have a national view of what's happening to those 22 million public sector employees who work in federal, state, and local government. But I do focus on the so-called Great Resignation. We think of it as the Great Reassessment. But any way you describe it, we think it's a permanent evolution in the world of work, where and how people want to work. And I've been 48 years in government in the world of work, and I think it's the biggest change I've seen, with the possible exception of the introduction of the computer into the world of work. What we've experienced over the last 3 years and what we continue to experience, this permanent evolution, I think is it's an extraordinary change. So you can see my screen, right, everybody?
Yeah, it looks good with it. Yeah.
Okay, so I like to kind of start at the end. So the key takeaways, as I mentioned, permanent evolution in the world of work, which has resulted particularly in government. And in government, we're kind of at a disadvantage with respect to the private sector in our ability to attract and retain talent. Intense competition, employee engagement, and I'll describe what that is, what it means, why it matters. Research has shown, decades of research, which I'll cover in about 5 minutes, the key to attraction, retention, and performance. How do you build engagement? How do you create that connection between the employee and the organization? It's through what's known as a positive employee experience. And someone said, I heard someone say this a couple of weeks ago, what's not measured doesn't matter. So you got to measure this stuff, right? And I know, Kurt, you're going to be showing some data. I'm going to be showing some as well. We can't guess about how our employees are feeling, what makes a difference to them, what they feel good about, what they don't feel good about. We have to collect, analyze, and act on data. So the new world of work, everyone wants more flexibility, was described as, has been described as maximum flexibility. Whether you're like me and you sit in front of your computer every day and you can work in your den, or you're in law enforcement, or you fight fires, you're in public works, or you're in corrections, and you can't video it in, you can't zoom it in. You have to continue to report to your work site. And for many government organizations, especially in local government, 50% or more of their employees have not been able to work remotely. They've had to continue to report to their work sites, risking their health, risking their lives, and the health and lives of their families to continue to deliver public services. But they want flexibility too. Maximum flexibility. We describe this Great Resignation as really the Great Reassessment. People have taken the opportunity, I want to describe it like that, over the past 3 years, to reconsider what they want out of work and how work integrates with their personal lives. And I'll show you some, I think, pretty compelling data about that. Intense competition, major demographic changes. Now, I typically ask this question and nobody can answer it, but I bet somebody here can answer it. You can use your chat feature. When was the first US Census? And Dennis, you can't answer this because I know you know the answer. When was the first US Census? This is the audience participation part.
Let's see what
you know. It was in a year ending with 0.
I'm going to say 2010. I mean, 1910.
The first one. The first one.
Oh.
Anybody? Where's the chat? Can we? Okay, we got one person in the chat, right? Let's
1860.
See. Oh, Susan, you got it. You're the first person. I've done this presentation probably 10 times that got it right. So I should have expected that this group would know. 1790. For the first time since the first census in 1790, the 2020 census, the number of white males, people like me, actually declined, not just as a percentage of the US population, but as a raw number. So, and that's just one of the enormous demographic changes that are going on in this country. So what that tells us, among other things, is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, not just the right thing to do, focusing on it, but it is a business imperative. And this is, I think, an underappreciated issue. Someone described it as the divided workforce, remote and on-site employees, haves and have-nots, right? As police, fire, public works, corrections, they continue to report to their work sites, and people like me work at home, you know, in my pajama bottoms, doing who knows what. we did a survey in my previous job, the Institute for Public Sector Employee Engagement, a national survey of public sector employees, got 20,000 responses from people across the country. About half of those folks, this was during the pandemic, were forced to continue to report to their work sites. Across the board, they were less satisfied with every aspect of their work lives. So this is an issue, not just in retail and food service, but in government, state and local government in particular, federal government as well. We have to understand what these two components of our bifurcated workforce, what these folks want, and we have to meet those needs. So some data. You've all seen the numbers. 4 million people quit every month for the past 14 months. 11 million job vacancies, almost 2 open positions for every person who's looking for a job. Government, 565,000 vacancies as of the last BLS data. 627 fewer state and local government jobs now compared to February of 2020, the beginning of the pandemic. So while the private sector has recovered a lot of those jobs, the public sector has not. Survey done by Mission Square Research, an organization, if you're not familiar with it, you should be. 52% of public sector employees who responded to this survey said that they are inclined to be looking for another job. So as I like to say, if you're still working, if you're not thinking about leaving, the person next to you is. 52%.
Wow.
This is from the Washington Post op-ed page. Slow-moving crisis is paralyzing states and cities. Those of you who follow the Washington Post know that the op-ed page typically doesn't focus on the state and local government workforce. So it has risen to that level. And the accompanying chart for this article shows, look at that blue line. This is the difference between the beginning of the pandemic and now, showing a decline, 627,000 jobs, 3.4%, that blue line, both blue lines, compared to the beginning of the pandemic. So not only is it hard to attract and retain, but also the number of jobs in the public sector has not recovered since the beginning of the pandemic. Here's some headlines from various media. It took me about an hour to come up with these. It wasn't very hard. I'm not going to read these. You can read them. But this one in the upper right-hand corner, this was very interesting and sad. Government worker shortages worsen crisis response. And there were several examples in this article. One was the Jackson, Mississippi water crisis, in which there was a shortage of water treatment operators for the city, which contributed to the crisis. And there were other examples in this article as well. And, I've said this before, and I'll say it again, when government fails, people can die, right? Katrina, other examples. When government fails, people are at risk, the American public. And that's just one way of trying to describe how critically important the work that public servants do. And, the Great Resignation is here and it's real. Desperate U.S. cities pitch Wall Street style sign-on bonuses. Now, I don't know about the Wall Street style, but there are local governments that are offering sign-on bonuses, $10,000, $15,000 in fields like law enforcement, because they simply cannot hire people. All of those quitters, the 4.1 million people who quit every month, someone asked me, where are they going? Some of them are retiring, but the answer is they're going to better jobs. Some of it is pay. I've spoken to public servants who have said, I can no longer work for this city or this county because I can make more money at McDonald's. If we're competing with McDonald's for talent, we need to fix that. But most of them are leaving because they're looking for a better working environment. They're looking for better culture. They're looking for more flexibility. Another survey showed that 70% of employees will no longer work for organizations that do not share their values. So these people are voting with their feet, seeking jobs, in many cases, that better fit their lifestyles. This is also from the Washington Post. As you can tell, I read the Washington Post. We lived there for 20 years, so still have that connection. Perks from home, virtual pizza parties, wellness services, employee benefits have transformed during the pandemic. And the examples, obviously, employee assistance programs, but employers are paying for things like babysitters, pet adoption fees, providing food care packages, gym memberships, virtual events. One of the organizations that I worked with in my previous job, it was a housing authority, provided tutoring services for the children of their employees in order to help their employees' kids keep up while they were going to school remotely. Waste management company, which competes head to head with many local governments, is now offering scholarships, not just to their employees, but to their family members, their employees' family members. So, you know, public sector can't compete with a lot of this stuff, but it needs to understand what the landscape is. And the landscape is things are changing, including in benefits. This is a pretty good data point. I mentioned that particularly in the public sector, some of these folks who are leaving the workforce are retiring. And, you know, we've been hearing about this retirement tsunami for like 15 years. Well, this is a survey was done again by Mission Square Research, polled HR directors and leaders in the public sector and asked them, when do you think retirements will take place? 69% said either now or in the next few years. And we could spend an hour just talking about these numbers because this has enormous implications for the public sector, for hiring, for leadership development, for training and development, for succession planning, because a lot of these people who are leaving, who are planning to retire, are going to be in leadership positions. And because in government, typically folks can retire at an earlier age and still have defined benefits plans, this retirement tsunami is probably going to impact the public sector faster and more dramatically than in the private sector. So this employer of choice, we've all heard that expression, right? Everybody wants to be an employer of choice. We want people who are looking for jobs to consider our organization to be above the mean, to be the place there where they want to work. So how do you be employer of choice? You build employee engagement. A lot of data, and I'll share with you some of it, about 30 years of it. I've been involved in generating some of it myself. But what does that mean? And I wrote this book a few years ago. One of my previous jobs was at the Partnership for Public Service, which is a nonprofit located in Washington, D.C., nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to helping public sector organizations, primarily the federal government, attract and retain talent. And one of my jobs as vice president of research was producing the annual Best Places to Work in the Federal Government, which is a rating and ranking of around 400 federal agencies and subcomponents. Comes out every year. And as I began my own education about employee engagement, this is around 15 years ago, it became clear to me that employee engagement was a big deal in the private sector. A lot was being said and written about it, but not as much in the public sector. A lot of data in the private sector showing that high engagement companies outperform low engagement companies and all the financial metrics. Revenue, sales, profit, earnings per share, stock prices, all that stuff. But not nearly as much had been written and said about the public sector and the differences between the public and private sectors and the implications of those differences for measuring and improving employee engagement. And I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but I have a friend from high school who was a senior executive in a major insurance company. And I won't tell you what it is, but think of a red umbrella. And when he and I talk about the difference between the public and private sectors, I always end the conversation by asking him to let me know when his board is going to open its board meetings up to the public and televise them, like public sector organizations do. And of course, that's never going to happen, but that usually ends the conversation. So here's a cartoon from Dilbert. Boss says we need more what the management experts call employee engagement. Dilbert, the boss says, I don't know the details, something to do with you idiots working harder for the same pay. Dilbert saying anything different on your end. The boss says, I think I'm supposed to be happier. So as Dilbert usually shows us, tells us, this is not the way to approach employee engagement. So what is this thing, this construct? called employee engagement. It's really about creating the environment, the culture, the conditions for employees to feel good about the work that they do, feel like they're making a difference, feel like they're making a contribution, believe the organization values them, and in return, they're willing to deliver what is known in the research as discretionary effort, which simply means they're willing to do whatever it takes, within reason, of course, to help the organization succeed. And it goes above and beyond satisfaction. Employees can be satisfied because their compensation is fair. We hope that's the case. Benefits are good, and benefits still are pretty good in the public sector, and their workloads are reasonable. So we want people to feel good about those things, but we want them to take that next step up and have that connection. So we think of satisfaction as necessary but not sufficient for engagement. Another way to think of engagement is it's the opposite of employee burnout, or what is now known as quiet quitting, which is another kind of hip term that's making the rounds. Engaged employees are not burned out, and they're not quietly quitting. They have that strong connection. And one of the things engaged employees do is they say good things about where they work. One of the questions in most employee engagement surveys is, would you recommend this place as a good place to work? Engaged employees say yes. And that's important for at least a couple of reasons. First of all, it pushes back on the stereotype about government, that it's a bad place to work. So we want to move the needle of public opinion about government. We also want people to appreciate that it is a good place to work, so they consider careers in the public sector. So having engaged employees not only affects how the organization operates internally, but it also affects how people view the organization from outside. That's why it has implications for not just retention, but also attraction. So why does this stuff matter? Decades of research, a lot of it in the private sector, but also in the public sector. And I'm going to share with you in a few minutes a summary of about 30 years of this research. And I'll show you a bunch of numbers and ideas for you to memorize the numbers, but just to appreciate that there is empirical research. But I want to show you a picture first. So I show this a lot. This is, actually have a calendar, which is around here somewhere, that has a picture like this for every day of the year, 365 pictures. And the calendar is entitled, "You Only Had One Job to Do." So I show this a lot. And I remember I showed this to a city that we were working with, to the senior managers, the department directors. And in the room was the director of public works. And I said, "This picture was not taken in your city, I don't think." And he laughed. He's a nice guy. He said, "You think this is bad?" He said, "I've seen it where it's a car in the road and not a branch, and they painted around the car." And I said, "Wow." I said, "Do you have a picture of that?" And he said, "Absolutely not."
Oh.
So this was, I like to describe this as a work product, and I use that term advisedly, done by someone who is actively disengaged, who shows up at work every day and tries to undo the good work that their colleagues are doing. So anyway, here's the actual data. This is from Gallup. Gallup has an engagement survey like a lot of organizations do, including UKG. We actually, Great Place to Work, which is Fortune magazine's partner in the engagement survey business, is part of UKG. But this is from Gallup. This is a summary of millions of engagement surveys that Gallup has administered, primarily the private sector around the world, comparing some key indicator results, high engagement companies with low engagement companies. So the top 25% in their database to the bottom 25%. You can read the data. What I like to point out is turnover. And typically in government, we are low turnover organizations. More than 40% lower turnover in high engagement organizations. So someone said, and I think this was right on target, if we want to solve the recruiting problem, we need to solve the retention problem. Because the more people we can retain, the fewer we have to spend time, money, and resources to hire. Fewer safety incidents, fewer absenteeism. And keep in mind, you're looking at the differences between the top and bottom 25%. We were looking at the differences between the top 10%, 5%, 1%. The differences would be even more dramatic. So that's primarily private sector. I've also been involved at the Institute with several national surveys, random sample of employees in the public and private sectors in a variety of occupations. I'm going to share with you some of those results from the most recent survey. One of the questions or statements is, my organization is successful at achieving its mission. And you can see the engaged employees, and these are statistically significant differences, are much more likely to say that they believe their organization is successful at achieving its mission than the not engaged employees across the board, all levels of government. Also, all levels of government, much more likely to agree, engaged employees that is, they can contribute to things like quality, cost savings, and customer service. And don't we want people in government to believe that they can contribute to these kinds of outcomes? This is, I think, particularly compelling about employee mental health. This was a question they now, included in the most recent survey. How would you rate your overall mental health percent? You see percent good or very good. Across the board, all levels of government and in the private sector, engaged employees are up to twice, more than twice, as likely to feel good about their mental health, to feel good about their employee well-being. Very powerful. A lot of conversation now about employee well-being as we emerge from the pandemic, because what happens to us at work affects how we feel about our lives in general. And if organizations can maintain a high level of engagement, it's going to affect positively how people feel about their lives in general. So we roll all this stuff up into what we call the employee value chain, engagement value chain. So improving engagement drives better organizational performance, showed you some of the results. That leads to higher customer satisfaction. That leads to more trust in government. And if the people who deliver service believe that the people they deliver those services to trust them, they're also more likely to feel engaged. So that is why we call this a virtuous cycle. And I'll quote you another piece of research from when I was at the partnership. We asked Gallup to do a telephone survey, and because that's a lot of what Gallup does. One of the questions Gallup asked the folks who answered the phone is, think about your most recent interaction with someone in government. In this case, it was the federal government. And whether or not you were satisfied with that interaction, not whether or not you got the answer you wanted, but whether or not you felt like you got good customer service. And when the people who answered the phone answered yes to that question, they felt like they got good customer service. They were also 3 times more likely to say that they felt good about government overall. So think about that. That means that individual public servants can move the needle of public opinion one interaction at a time. If they're engaged, if they know their stuff, and if they provide good customer service. I think that's very, very powerful and very empowering. I think shows at a very micro level why employee engagement is important. Here is what's the city, Henderson, Nevada. I think it's the second largest city in Nevada. It bills itself as America's premier community. I've done work with Henderson, and this is we didn't do this; they did this themselves. City must be accountable, etc. City is proud of its 93% customer satisfaction, citizen resident satisfaction, and 90% employee engagement. Now, I know that correlation is not cause and effect, and someone has already asked a question about that. But I don't think it's a coincidence that this city has world-class employee engagement, and 90% is world-class. At the same time, it's got 93% customer satisfaction. Now, if you ask me if I can prove that that's cause and effect, the answer to that is no, but I don't believe in that kind of coincidence. I believe there is a relationship. So then the question becomes, all right, if this engagement stuff is so important, how do we build it? How do we create a high level of engagement? How do we connect employees so that they feel good about the work that they do and the mission, and they feel like they're making a difference? And it's about a positive employee experience. another trendy term, employee experience, that if you read any of the HR literature, you're gonna see that come up. What does it mean? It's the employee's interactions between the employer, or the interactions between the employer and the employee, sometimes described as moments that matter. They could be every day, weekly, monthly, annually. Could be when the employee starts with the organization, when the employee leaves the organization. Moments that matter. Like these, the entire employee life cycle. We like to think of it as hire to retire. Guy that I know referred to it as cradle to grave. I don't like that quite as much. I think hire, retire is better. But even before the employee joins the organization, the experience begins with the recruiting and hiring process. I was on a panel last week, and one of the other panelists, who shall remain nameless, the organization, was bragging that they had reduced time to hire in their jurisdiction to 170 days. Time to hire. Now, actually, that was a significant reduction in what it previously was, but I still think it had a long way to go. And someone once described the federal government hiring process, it wasn't me, as being so slow and convoluted that it resulted in hiring the best of the desperate. Now, as a former federal employee, I disassociate myself from that comment, but I think it is indicative. My boss at the Partnership for Public Service likes to talk to the federal hiring process as being a target-rich environment. There's a lot of ways to improve it. Onboarding, resources, training and development, managing performance, etc. And pay and benefits is a factor, but only one factor in the employee experience. So positive employee experience, engaged, stable, diverse, inclusive, high-performing workforce, and then that drives organizational performance and a positive customer experience. So here's some more data from a guy by the name of Josh Burson. Some of you may have heard of him. He spends a lot of time doing research on the employee experience, and this is a summary of his research. I like the blue in the middle. Organizations with a positive employee experience, 5 times more likely to be a great place to work, create a sense of belonging, and to engage and retain employees, and some other key outcomes as well. So, this whole employee engagement, employee experience, this stuff matters. And it's not just about making sure our employees are happy all the time, or social events. We want our employees to be happy, at least most of the time, but it's really about connecting them to the organization. Often when I talk about engagement, it's about social events. Let's have a hangout. Let's have a virtual happy hour. Let's form a social committee. I have a quote in my book: free pizza and Coke on a Friday afternoon is not an engagement strategy. It's a nice thing to do. Free wine and pizza on a Friday evening isn't an engagement strategy. It's a nice thing to do and could be part of it, but it's not really getting at the conditions. People don't leave organizations because they didn't get free pizza. They leave organizations because it's not the right place for them to work, not the right environment, not the right culture. And as I mentioned earlier, what happens internally affects how people perceive the organization externally, and affects the ability of the organization to attract talent. And I'll show you an example of that. You go to these job sites, Indeed, Glassdoor, what you'll see are employee comments about the organization right next to the vacancy announcement. So if you're employed, and these are actual employee reviews for public sector organizations. These are 1- and 2-star organizations. Run fast and run far, stuck in one job for life, not a good place to work at. 1- and 2-star. So if you've got these kinds of reviews, good luck attracting talented people to your organization. You need these kinds of reviews. 5-star reviews. The good, they're all inclusive. They train you well. You feel a sense of accomplishment every day. The bad, can't really think of one.
Wow.
So I always encourage public sector organizations, you need to go to your Indeed site and see what your employees are saying about you. And sometimes they say, well, they're disaffected employees. These are all sour grapes. Well, they can't all be sour grapes. So you need to understand what your employees are saying about you, because that's going to influence how people see the organization. And government has a branding problem. This is another cartoon. When I grew up going into public service, wow, what a coincidence. I want to work at McDonald's too. People do not appreciate, and there's evidence of this as well, empirical, all of the ways that government positively affects their lives. And people who are looking for jobs also don't understand how they can make a difference in government or the many job opportunities. I'll give you one example. Engineers who are engineering students. We did some research at the partnership. When they are asked what they know about engineering opportunities in government, most of them say, I don't know anything about engineering opportunities in government. I'm not studying political science. I'm not studying government. I'm an engineering student. They do not know that the biggest single employer of engineers in this country is the public sector. And among the public sector, the biggest single employer is the federal government. And that's across the board. People do not appreciate the variety of opportunities and the ability to make a difference. Government has a branding problem. And when you go to a vacancy announcement on Indeed or Glassdoor, and it's a position description, with 20 things that the incumbent has to do and 15 requirements, and the basic qualification is you must have 5 years of experience and a college degree, even if the job doesn't require 5 years of experience and a college degree. It's hard to recruit if you're describing your jobs in adult and bureaucratic fashion like that. And it drives me crazy when I see must have 5 years of experience. That means if I have 4.5 years of experience, but I'm a terrific employee, I am not qualified for that job. But if I have 5 years of experience and I'm a terrible employee, then I am qualified for that job. So government needs to put in place processes to figure out if people can do the job and not rely on these arbitrary, my word, qualifications, because those qualifications also have implications, negative implications, for the ability of government to attract a diverse applicant pool. Now, obviously, if there is an academic requirement or certification requirement, that's different. But these arbitrary requirements are not making government competitive. So how do we know if the employee experience is positive, right? Well, we can't guess. We need to collect and analyze data. I have a book here, not a book I wrote. It's entitled 180 Ways to Improve Employee Engagement. So good luck working your way through each of those 180 ways until you figure out what's actually going to work in your organization. So this is more audience participation. How many public sector jurisdictions do you think there are in this country? We know there are 50 states in the district.
God.
We know there are hundreds of federal agencies, but cities, counties, townships, special districts, villages, how many? We'll open up the chat again.
God.
It's a lot. Take a guess.
Because you're counting mosquito districts.
Wheels are turning in Terry's head. We're running out of time.
I don't know.
90,000.
Wow.
Every one of those organizations is different, right? We're all special. That applies to organizations as well. Different cultures, different political situations, different budget situations. And every one of them is going to be different. And you need to understand what's going on in your workforce before you can take action to improve the employee experience and improve employee engagement. I've done more than 100 surveys of public sector organizations, employee surveys, and I can tell you there is great variability from organization to organization, and even within organization. You take a city. Police officers are going to have different issues than people who work in finance or HR. Great variability even within organizations. So you have to have data. Like what? Applicant pools. You need to know who's applying for your jobs. And who's making it through the funnel? Who's showing up at the other end? How many people are you losing because maybe it's taking too long for the process? What's the demographic breakdown of people who are applying, people who are making it through the process, people who are dropping out? Diversity, not just at the overall level, 10% of our employees are this and 30% of our employees are that, but do you have diversity throughout the organization? In too many cases, people of color are in lower paying frontline jobs, but not in leadership positions. Certainly the same thing for gender. So you got to drill down. Retention and turnover. Look under the numbers, not just what the overall turnover rate is. We only have an 8% turnover rate, so I guess we're doing okay. Well, maybe, but who's leaving and who's staying? I'll talk about that a little more. Who's showing up? Who is working overtime? That has implications, of course, for compensation, but it also has implications for employee fatigue, which is a big issue right now, particularly in 24/7 operations, healthcare, police, fire, human services, corrections. Are people working double and triple shifts and therefore putting the people that they're serving at risk? Got to have data to understand that. And then collect data directly from employees, focus groups, conversations with employees. What do you like about working here? What motivates you? Why might you stay? Why might you think about leaving? Exit and stay interviews. Exit interviews are useful, even though I think of them as kind of the ultimate lagging indicator, right? People are at the door or already out the door. But the other approach is stay interviews. Like focus groups, what keeps you here? What do you like about working here? What can we do better to keep you here, keep your colleagues here? And then engagement surveys, employee surveys. We think this is the best and most comprehensive way to collect data on the employee experience. Ask every single employee in the organization to tell you how they feel about their job, the mission, their work, supervisor, leadership, resources, equity, inclusion, and diversity, culture, and so on. Everybody gets a vote. You only want them to vote once. That's all I'll say about that. But we want everyone to vote. Everyone has a voice, regardless of where you are in the organization, how much money you make, where you are in the bureaucracy. Everyone gets a vote. And we can also break the results out by organizational unit, by demographic group, really drill down on how employees feel about the organization, what they feel good about that the organization needs to keep doing, and what they don't feel so good about that the organization needs to improve. This is interesting. This is from a joint survey conducted by several professional organizations in the HR field in the public sector. And one of the questions is, what are the important issues in your organization? These are HR directors and leaders. 96% said employee engagement is a really important issue, but only 39% said they're surveying employees to understand the level of engagement and what drives engagement. And we refer to this difference as a data gap. You can't guess on this stuff. There was another piece of research, and I'm proud to say I had nothing to do with it, where HR directors were asked, what's the level of engagement in your organization? What percentage of your employees are engaged? And they got answers like 85, 90, 95%. And the follow-up question was, well, how do you know that? And they get answers like, well, when I walk down the hallway, people seem happy. So you got to have better data than that. And if those organizations really had 85, 90, 95% engagement, they would truly be world-class organizations. You got to collect data on this stuff. So I mentioned retention. We described this as the golden rule of retention, kind of a corny thing to say, but it's about looking behind, drilling down on the numbers. Who is staying or leaving? Are the good people staying, or are the good ones leaving? Are the poor performers leaving? We sometimes describe that as addition by subtraction. The people you want to leave, leaving, or the people you want to leave, staying with the organization. Newer, younger employees spend a lot of time, money, and resources to bring people into the organization. Are they hanging around? People make decisions about whether or not they're staying within the first few months. So we need to understand if our newer, including younger, we don't do a great job in government of attracting younger people to government. They're staying or leaving. Are there gaps with respect to turnover by demographic groups, race, ethnicity, mentioned age, gender? And if so, we need to take a look at those gaps and understand why certain people, certain groups are leaving more than others. Specific occupations and levels, departments, divisions, managers, certain pay levels. Drill down below the overall numbers to figure out who is staying and who is leaving. Employee recognition, I'm going to talk a little bit as we wrap up about some of the things that organizations are doing to try to build a positive employee experience. And recognition, you see some of the data here. 2 out of 3 people who say they leave their jobs say they're doing it because they don't feel appreciated. No recognition. It's not always about pay, and pay is an aspect of recognition, but it's not always about pay. And another interesting data point from Great Place to Work, which I said is part of UKG, 42% of employees who have left their organizations over the past few years are sorry that they left their organizations. You know, the grass is not always greener. So that tells us that organizations really need to do a better job of understanding why people are leaving and try to proactively keep them with the organization. Because almost half are saying, you know, maybe it wasn't such a good idea to leave. This is a list, recognition without spending a dime. Like I said, it's not always about pay. This is from UW Hospital. Put together a supervisor's toolkit, and in that toolkit is this list, recognition without spending a dime. Now, this was pre-COVID, so you know, maybe you don't have a physical department bulletin board, maybe it's a virtual department bulletin board. Some more. This mail handwritten note to an employee's home. I showed this to a group a couple weeks ago, and someone raised their hand and said, you know, I got a handwritten note from my supervisor, and he said, I can't tell you how happy that made me feel. Then my supervisor, instead of, you know, cranking out an email saying thank you, went to the trouble of a handwritten note and mailing it to my home. You know, sometimes little things make a difference. So recognition without spending a dime. It doesn't have to be money. This is another thing we talk about a lot, and I've talked about for a long time, new employee onboarding. Making sure that we give new employees the support, the resources, the information they need to do successfully. You know, you only get one chance at a first impression. When the new employee is ready for the job, we want the job to be ready for the new employee. And, you know, I have other cliches, but time is short. An integrated set of activities that begins before the new employee actually shows up and extends throughout the new employee's entire first year. We divide it into 5 phases. It could be 3, 7, 9, doesn't matter. And these are some of the activities, there's a longer list, that we believe should occur. And one of the important takeaways from this list is this isn't all HR stuff. A lot of it has to do with creating opportunities for the new employee to have a positive connection right from the start with their supervisor. And Susan just commented, first line supervisors are critical for success in large organizations. We've all heard the expression, people don't quit their jobs, they quit their bosses. Yeah. Critically important to make that connection right from the start. And when I talk about this stuff, I say, you know, there's no one size fits all solution to employee engagement, improving the employee experience. But if you're looking for low hanging fruit, this is it, because it doesn't cost a lot of money, or it shouldn't anyway, to make sure that new employees feel welcomed, and we provide them with the support, the resources, and the information they need to be successful. And there's a lot of research showing that organizations that do a good job of onboarding, higher levels of engagement, faster time to productivity, and better retention. So low-hanging fruit. So key takeaways: permanent evolution. Talked a little bit about what that means. Intense competition around attracting and developing talent. A lot of research showing employee engagement drives performance, retention, a lot of other positive outcomes. The way to build engagement is through employee experience, and we got to have data. We can't guess about this stuff, you know. And I say this a lot about HR. I don't mean this pejoratively because I'm in that business, but in HR, we're good at counting stuff. You know, we can count the number of people who we hire, how many people got their performance appraisals on time, how many people we trained. We're less good at measuring stuff. Are we hiring the right people? Are they hanging around? Are these performance management conversations making a difference? Is training and development making a difference? It's harder to measure stuff than it is to just collect data. And here's a quote I like, even though it's a private sector guy. This guy is head of Virgin Airlines and a bunch of other companies. Clients do not come first, employees do. If you take care of your employees, they will take care of your clients. And in government, we can substitute customers, residents, citizens, whatever. The point is the same. And I remember being in a meeting with the Gallup CEO, Jim Clifton, who is a kind of an eccentric guy. But he said a major hotel chain came to him and said, we would like Gallup to do a customer satisfaction survey. And Clifton said, we're happy to do it. We're happy to take your money. But if you really want to get bang for your buck, you will do an employee engagement survey. Because if your employees are engaged, all of the other stuff, including customer satisfaction, will follow. So this stuff matters.
Wow.
So anyway, thanks for your time. I would be happy to connect with you. LinkedIn, email, you know, follow up. Anybody wants to talk about this stuff more, I'm always happy to do that. I've been on a crusade for a long time to get public sector organizations to focus on this stuff because it matters. In my opinion, nothing matters more to the American public than the ability of government to deliver. And I hope more and more people, including the private sector, believe that. So I know we have some questions. We got a few more minutes before we move on to the next topic.
You see that last question there. You think we're going to go down to 30-hour week? I know my kids, who are all in their 30s and 40s, almost all of them only work 4 days a week.
Do they work 40 hours or they work 30, 32 hours?
32 hours, 30, 32 hours.
That's interesting. You know, I don't know. Somebody mentioned politics, and you know, in government, it's all wrapped up in politics, right? So are the politicians going to stand for public sector employees reducing the number of hours from 40 to 32 without reducing their compensation? I was reading an article a couple of weeks ago. A bunch of legislators, some state out west, are saying, and you know, I think I've heard about this here too, all public sector employees should report back to their offices and their work sites because my constituents are not getting good service from government employees. So, you know, maybe it makes some political points, but it ignores the reality that organizations that make that demand are not going to be competitive for talent. There was another piece of research came out just last week from the Partnership for Public Service, analyzing what I think they're Generation Z employees who were born after 1997. They consider remote work to be the status quo. They have never experienced anything but remote work. So forcing them to go to work in an office, it ain't going to work. So I don't know the answer to your question. I know a lot of organizations are trying to deal with flexibility for frontline employees who have to report to their work sites by giving them the opportunity to work 4 days, but 4 10-hour days. Mm-hmm. So you know, I don't know what it looks like out there.
What about?
I think there are a lot of people who are working 40 hours a week from home. I don't know about 32 hours.
What happens though when you have, just like you had the question about the frontline supervisors being so important, when you have people at the top of different things like we had here in Dane County, where the jokes were things like, "What's orange and sleeps for?" a Dane County highway truck, or the joke about people showing up and three people show up and one digs a hole, the other waters it, and the other one fills it back up, and the neighbor comes out and says, "What's going on?" They said, "Well, the guy who plants the trees didn't show up. He was sick." We got these jokes being told by top government people about their employees. And that seems to me like to be really counterproductive about what government can do when you have people like that tearing down government.
I couldn't agree with you more. I don't know why, they make political points, but they don't appreciate the deleterious effect that has on the workforce and also the ability to attract people to the workforce. I don't know. I hope there are enough. I've spoken with a lot of senior leaders in state and local government, and most of them get it. They understand that they need to have high engagement workforces and that the workforce is critical. These leaders have to understand that their ability to implement their policies depends on the workforce, right?
Yeah.
If they don't have talented and committed employees, their policies are just a bunch of words. So I don't know, Terry. I don't have a good answer except keep talking about all of the positive ways that government makes a difference in people's lives.
It looks like Elon Musk violated every single thing you said over the last week.
Well, you're not going to get me to defend him.
You got a couple of questions there.
Yeah. So causality, is engagement the cause or the effect? If you have an extra week sometime, you can drill into the literature and you can engage in that conversation. So, are engaged employees engaged because their organizations are successful, or organizations successful because their employees are engaged? I don't know. Maybe the arrow work both ways. We like to think that engagement drives performance, and I've seen some examples of organizations that have improved their performance by improving engagement. So that's the way I think a lot of the research shows the arrow is pointing, but you could make the argument in the other direction as well.
Are you reading the chats? I'll let you answer what you want.
I'm trying to. I'm not as agile
as you once were. Come on.
I'm not as agile with this stuff. Yeah, true about young people do not value economic security the same way that we did. I think it's true. They are a large employer providing defined benefit pensions. I don't think that's the reason recruitment is hard. I think it's because we don't make the case in government about the opportunities you have to make a difference. The other part of the research is young people are mission oriented, right? And where else, maybe the nonprofit world, but where else do you have the opportunity to contribute to an important mission like we do in government? But we don't promote that. We don't brand ourselves as places where young people can make a difference. So, maybe the pension has something to do with it, but I don't know. And I think we're up against the time, so I'm going to defer to you all. I know you got some other stuff on your agenda.
Yeah, well, and we'll do that. I want to ask you one quick question. You worked for the state, and then you worked for the university. And I was at both places for a little bit, and I found a very different culture at the university than the state. It was much more open and much more freewheeling. You were certainly much higher level than I was doing, but culture makes a difference in a place too, doesn't it?
Yeah, a key driver of engagement, absolutely.
Yeah.
So cultures of engagement. In other words, that's how we interact with each other. That's how we interact with our customers, and recognition and the mission connection. And in the university, I think maybe the mission connection was a little more clear than it was in state government.
Well, that's interesting.
And that might be one. And also, there was a lot of occupational diversity at the university, but there's an enormous amount of occupational diversity in state government. So different people, different organizations, different missions, different occupations, different clients, you're going to see a lot more variability, I think, in state government than in a place like a university.
I'll turn it over to Dennis to say thanks. Dennis, old personnel expert yourself.
Yeah. I hope I was preaching to the converted a little bit, Dennis.
Oh yeah, you bet. Yeah, no, this is very good. Very, very interesting. Really appreciate it, Bob.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the work that you all do and have done.
Thank you for your service in this. This is just
Thanks.
why we wanted you for so many years. So thank you for taking the time.
Glad we can make it happen. Thank you. And I hope everybody has a great holiday.
You too.
Okay, you too.
Travel safely. Bye-bye. Well, Kurt?
Yeah. Yep.
Amber? Kurt, you want to do your introductions and tell us what you're doing?
Sure. So I didn't know I was doing anything until last week. But I had a bunch of data that I watch. So my background is I'm an economist by training, and I worked at the LaFollette Institute for a bunch of years, like 8 years, as a labor economist under Don Nichols. And then part of that was a dark art to get the data that you needed to produce this stuff. And I got really good with technology. And I kind of grew up with the internet, and I left there in 1999, started an IT company and grew it, and then sold it in 2019. So I'm still on the board, but I get involved in some of this stuff, and I still follow economics pretty closely. Listen a lot to NPR's. They've got a couple of different ones. They got The Indicator is really quite good, and then Planet Money is really good. So both of those are quite good if people are interested in this stuff. Hopefully, I won't put you to sleep. Hopefully, this is interesting. I'm going to do this without a net. I do have a PowerPoint with my notes on it, and then I'm going to use live slides or live data from the Federal Reserve Board.
And you want to introduce Amber to us?
And then, yep. And the reason Amber's here is Amber's got an interesting background. She's both in a corporate environment, which is changing soon if she cares to share that, and she's a demand planner for the company called Vortex. But I'll let her explain that a little bit better. And then she's got a small business, and she's been fighting this supply chain problems. She sees demand coming in from while she's doing demand planning, they're talking to the same suppliers that very large companies use. So she's got a kind of a leading indicator on that. And then from there we're going to hit. I'm going to hit a little bit about inflation, a little bit about the recession. About recession, are we going to get into a recession, or we've got soft landing? And believe it or not, I wanted to finish up with labor force discussion, and some of it'll dovetail into what we did. So Amber, please explain who the heck you are.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So my name's Amber, and a quick background. I'm in my middle 30s, so if that kind of helps for context. After graduating Iowa State, I moved to Wisconsin, and I've spent the last 15 years in demand planning for product as well as the supply chain. They kind of go hand in hand. I spent a decade with Land's End in supply chain, and currently with Vortex Optics in supply chain. And my job is to forecast demand and make sure we have adequate inventory flow to supply all of our retail stores and web e-commerce, et cetera. On the other side of that, I also do own a small business. I have a private bakery that I built on my land. I'm a sole landowner, and I've built a bakery on our land, and I sell, my sister and I sell bread and pies by the thousands every year. We work farmers markets and small events and deliveries. The pandemic was, it's kind of weird to say, but the pandemic was amazing for our business. We were able to pivot very quickly during the pandemic to not curbside, but front porch deliveries with a website. Along with that, I also run the Ridgeway Farmers Market, which Ridgeway is a small town between Dodgeville and Mount Horeb on Highway 151. So shameless plug there, if you're ever in that area, come see an amazing small town farmers market. My job is to manage that market, promote it online, and I also on the side help rural women, especially, to start their own small businesses, if that is their desire, and to actually make a supporting income for their families. So there we go.
And Amber's taking time away from, if it's Thanksgiving week, so that
Yes.
she's been baking like crazy.
Yeah, for context, my sister and I are going through about 176 pies just this week to deliver. And I want to say probably 190 or 200 loaves of bread that will deliver Thanksgiving morning.
You should have flour on your nose.
I tried to clean up for you guys.
Okay.
So I switched my my hairnet for a beanie because yeah.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned, the stuff that I want to cover is a little bit about inflation and then the Fed's response to it a little bit, which we know what's going, and then what I see, and then some of the fun little esoteric data sets that I watch on a regular basis and what the heck they mean.
Okay.
And then so I'm going to share my screen if I can do
And then
that.
as Kurt talks about his data, I'll kind of share some real world examples of what that data is actually, how it's actually translating into corporate world and small business.
So if that worked, and it should have, you should.
Yeah, we got it.
Okay, cool. So, this is just CPI, Consumer Price Index, and you can see it's pretty flat all the way along here. And the reason it's been so the Fed set an interest target of 2%. That actually, believe it or not, I think is borrowed from Japan. But we figured out that our economy runs better if there's just a low level of inflation. But obviously it's ticked up here starting right after the pandemic. And I think there's a bunch of reasons. I can hit that a little bit, but I thought maybe I could pull this back so that this crowd will remember, that the mid 1970s and then 1980. You'll remember what inflation was like then. So in context, the reason there's two lines, one includes food and energy, one does not. The Fed does not include food and energy. They took that out for their official calculation. They took that out in actually the predecessor to Paul Volcker, who is the guy that raised interest rates really, really heavily. He was a Federal Reserve chair in the late 70s, raised interest rates to the prime rate ended up about 19 or 20%. And he just kept raising interest rates until he knocked inflation down, but it caused a recession. Part of this, arguably why both Carter and Ford only had one term apiece. So let's see. So I think there's several reasons for inflation. One that I talked about last year is an increase in money supply. So we really pushed money out into the market, right? We gave companies loans that were forgiven. We gave people direct payments for kids for stimulus, and we did that at an unprecedented rate. And I looked at that and went, oof, I think this is going to cause inflation, because I was taught you put enough, you put more money in the top end of this in this system, and more money flows out to everybody, and it causes inflation. I didn't know why this didn't happen in 2008, but most of the money that came out went as loans to corporations that were paid back with interest. So we did not spend this amount of money. So this is an interesting one to me, which is M2 money. I explained what M2 money was last year. It's basically money. It's all money that's liquid, right? So it's deposits under $100,000. It's savings account, checking account, believe it or not, traveler's checks, and if they're still around, so it's fairly liquid cash. So this line, and I couldn't recreate the one I did last year, but basically that stays pretty constant at about just a little under 6% of GDP, gross domestic product. And we started doing it, and we started loosening the money supply in 2008, right? 2002, and then we really just hammered it here, right? So it's interesting. We're getting close to cash out, as much cash out as our entire GDP is, which that's going to cause inflation in my book. So we weren't the only people doing this. It was done worldwide, right? We had loose monetary policies all over the developed countries, and even many of the developing countries. They all did the same thing. So we have a fairly myopic view that we're the only ones that this matters, but everybody increased the money supply. Typically, if money goes out and it goes to wealthy individuals, it doesn't get respent. So that doesn't cause inflation typically, because you give somebody that's well fed $100, they're going to stick it in savings. So it ends up what's referred to as a liquidity trap. But what we did in this case is we handed it out to everybody or basically anybody making under $75,000 a year. And the other thing I think is causing it is there's a shift. I mean, there's a huge shift in buying pattern because of the pandemic. We bought more goods than services. Services really cratered. It's coming back now, but that's got a big piece of it. And then, as everybody knows, the pandemic causes supply chain snarls, and that's still ongoing. And then I did not predict that there was going to be a war in Europe, which does not help either. Now, Amber, I know you can talk a little bit about the supply chain stuff. Do you want to do that now, or do you want to do that a little bit later?
Yeah, let's start with that. So I'm lucky that I got to see how the supply chain all played out from a big corporation or big business and small business side. And pretty much everything you saw in the news is what was happening at my level. Now, so all that background. So the supply chains in general in the last 6 months have improved significantly. So we're seeing less delays in shipments. I guess the thing that's happening right now, though, is with the supply chains, we're seeing too much inventory now because the economy, people have slowed down their buying habits, and therefore stores, retailers are slowing down on restocking their inventory, and therefore big businesses like Vortex Optics are slowing down how much we buy, how much we inventory from our factories overseas, who are now seeing higher capacity, more capacity freed up in their factories, and are starting to lower prices to get capacity in their factories. So that's a very high level look at what we've seen just in the last 6 months since all of the supply chain issues were taking place.
Amber, can you be a little more granular about what does it mean, a supply chain piece? Like, all right, I want a scope for my rifle to go deer hunting this weekend. What pieces couldn't you get at Vortex? A lens, a metal casing? Mm-hmm. What literally granular piece was stuck in a supply chain?
Yeah, so I guess if you think about a rifle scope, so my job is really apparel. I run the apparel. So let's use a t-shirt, actually. Sure. Okay. So if you think about a t-shirt doesn't just come from a factory. That factory also has to source all the materials, the cotton, the unfinished cotton goods, any details or trims that go on a t-shirt or apparel item. All that has to be sourced from other factories before it gets to the factory that's going to actually create it. So when you dig down into the granular level of the supply chain, when everything was going wrong, it's because everything down to the detail level of a t-shirt had to be sourced and was having supply chain issues. So then once it gets through the factories, it has to get on a ship. And when we were at the peak of COVID, every factory, every company wanted to get, I'll throw this number out, maybe 50% to 100% more inventory than they normally would have needed. And everybody needed to get it all on a ship at once. So therefore we had the ship delays or the in-transit delays. And that's where in the news, everyone was seeing the ports filled and ships just waiting out for weeks, sometimes on end, to get in, to get unloaded. So that was what was happening probably at the granular level of the supply chain. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, that helps to explain it. Go ahead. I thank you.
Sure. So anyway, that all just kind of ties back to what Kurt's showing you on some of these graphs. You know, as you see, you know, he'll show you personal savings, how that went up, spending habits, things like that, how all that translated in the supply chain.
So the other part that I wanted to hit on inflation that we tend to forget is that it really hits the poor and the bottom end of our social status the hardest, right? I mean, goods and service at discount stores. Looked it up. So like so typically we can change, you know, they have less ability to change from, say, their premium brand to a store brand or switch stores from one store to another. But people that shop at places like the dollar stores, right? So Dollar General, there was a study on them. Their inflation rate was actually 24%. Aldi was 17%. So there was a study done there too. So I mean, very, very different. It hits our society very non-even.
But of course, Kurt, you're not. The other thing about this is that we had to do something because of COVID, right? I mean,
yes, I did not. So the fact that we put a bunch of money into the market, we did not have a choice. Our economy would have cratered, is my belief. We would have had something akin to the Great Depression, right? I really believe that.
there's two evils. There were two evils, but how to balance it. And back at the beginning of this, I think the Feds and the Treasury both denied that it would be a problem. And I think that's frustrated a lot of people like you, because you could see it was going to be a problem. Yes, we got to do this, but there will be a problem. So let's admit it will be a problem later, solve this, and then solve the next one. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. And we did not have a plan for this, right? So there was no plan. So the money got dumped out very, very quickly. And you know, arguably people got it that shouldn't, but some did. You know, anyway. But I don't believe we had a choice. So, the one thing I want to hit on is so what they're trying. So the Fed always, in the last several years, they broadcast what they're going to do the next quarter and the next quarter after that, next quarter after that. And the reason they do that is perception is everything, right? If people think they're going to be hawkish on inflation, they will tend to you know, believe it, and it will have the impact. And then we're also, what they're trying to avoid now is what's referred to as a wage price spiral. So people expect that there's going to be inflation, so they demand a higher wage, which causes inflation.
Kurt, I'm going to jump in here and answer a question.
Yeah.
So Bill's asking about the differences between larger supply chains and the small business side. So I'll answer that one first. So definitely, yes, the supply chain issues are all there across the board. With small business, we were lucky enough to, when we were seeing these supply chains, across anything from food to unfinished goods, anything, and being a bakery producing perishable goods, what we had to do was invest cash flow into bulk supplies. Now I'm lucky enough to have a sourcing background, which simply means I'm able to source unfinished goods, ingredients for both corporate and small business pretty easily. I understand how to do it. But even we had to pivot to investing large amounts of cash into ingredients just to keep our prices low and to keep up with the supply chain issues. We had to order a lot more at a time because sometimes we didn't know if in a week we could still get it. Luckily, we were in a position to do that. And then your second question on how much the supply chain is impacted by China's ability to iron out their COVID policy. So what happens, we do get a lot of our items at Vortex from China. What we did during the pandemic, because of China's harsh rules on COVID, was we moved a lot of our production to surrounding countries that maybe could get it to us even a month faster. And we find that we are still with some of our factories flip-flopping product between China and another country that might be able to produce it faster, but we'll go back to China if COVID isn't an issue at the moment. So it's a lot of flip-flopping, a lot of resourcing, and looking for new factories for those things.
So Amber, again, be granular here. For
Oh,
your
sorry, I do have a tendency to be high level.
for your small business, that means you need to buy more chocolate chips. Now you need a place to store them. You need to have more flour. You have a place
Yeah,
to store
your
that.
flour, you did that, right, Amber, with
I
flour?
Is that
did,
what you're
yeah.
talking about?
We were, as an example, flour, we were ordering by the pallet loads, which historically we were able to get, 2 weeks supplies of flour. So we didn't need to do that. But yes, we had to find space for all this extra inventory, and that created a whole new project in itself, which we never saw coming.
It also hit your cash flow.
It did,
Yeah,
yes,
the cash
absolutely. And I will say, even with Vortex, and this is actually going to be consistent across the retail industry, a lot of companies right now, small business and big business, have a lot of their cash flow wrapped up in inventory. And we are starting to see the effects from that. We just aren't going to be buying more from factories. And that goes back to what I was saying about factories are seeing too much capacity open right now, which is going to have another effect on the global economy. And that's what's coming.
God, Amber, I don't know how you sleep at night because you have tugs the international brain and the local Ridgeway brain.
Oh, yes.
In each direction.
I can find you flour from China, or I can find you flour from Ridgeway, Wisconsin. There's local and international supply chains.
That's amazing. What a position you're in.
It's fun. I never thought we'd be the topic of conversation my entire career, but we are now, and people actually have questions.
Well, okay, Kurt.
So obviously the Federal Reserve's, or the Fed's response to this is raise interest rates, or quantitative tightening as opposed to quantitative easing. What that means is they stop buying corporate bonds or US bonds, which they have a lot on their balance sheet, and they are starting to wind that down and sell them. They're still got them. What that does is it props up bonds in a place where there's where there's economic stress, right? They have the ability to buy things. That we learned again from Japan, and we we first did it in 2008 when we had a meltdown in the housing market to prop up the economy, and then we had it again in obviously during the pandemic. So that's quantitative easing or quantitative tightening, right? And then and the Fed, by the way, it often gets referred to as they take away the punch bowl. As soon as the economy gets going well, just like a party, they pull away the punch bowl. The other one is they raised the interest rates, and I've got that here as well. And I wanted to, and I actually do have it pulled way back to, the 80s here, right? So what interest rates, what prime rates were in 1980, not anywhere near where they are now. They were low, extremely low here to keep the economy, to kind of help the economy, stimulate the economy. But I think, well, they only can change one interest rate, and it's pretty crude. I refer to it as a sledgehammer to kill a bug. Well, and Terry, you asked me, what do I mean by that? And I'll get into that a little bit. my opinion, though, the Fed should have started this sooner than they did, because once this gets underway, it's much more difficult to tamp it down. Again, we're kind of myopic. We look at it as US centric, but we're not the only countries that are doing this. Everybody across the developed countries are having to raise interest rates to knock down inflation. One of the things that does that's kind of interesting that is that it makes the dollar more or makes it stronger. And why does it do that? During times of uncertainty, people rush into the US market. They want dollars. Also, raising interest rates makes us pretty attractive, makes bonds in the US pretty attractive. But it actually, so that's part of it. The other piece that I wanted to mention is one of the things that we forget about is third world countries or developing countries. Is really hard on them because their debt, and many of them have heavy debt, are denominated in US dollars. So if their currency becomes less valuable and the US dollar gets stronger, their debt just became bigger. The other thing that people, it's useful to know is that almost all commodities, including oil and cotton, and I think all grains that people buy across the world, those are denominated in US dollars. So they're priced in US dollars. So if you're in another country and your currency just went down, now that's become extremely expensive.
And Kurt, you were just in Guatemala. Did you run into that in terms of what their money is compared to, or they use our dollar?
They actually peg it to our dollar. So I didn't see it as much there, but I wasn't there long enough this time. I go there quite often, but I was not there enough this time. But in the formal economy, just to put it in perspective, in the formal economy, their minimum wage, which most people are on, is $5,400 a year. So
okay.
So
and the bonds being bought now, these are not like World War II bonds that it's going to be a big spike 20 years from now or something.
No, these are just regular bonds. But one of the bonds everybody on this call should be somewhat interested in, and it was obscure up to this point because it came out in the 90s, I think. It's called an I bond, and you can do up to $10,000 a year in it, and it actually uses the calculated inflation plus an interest rate. So right now that you have to keep it there for I think 2 years, but then you can pull it out and you lose up to 5 years. You lose the last quarter of interest on it. But the interest rate on it right now I think is 9 or 10%.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. So if you've got excess cash, that is a wonderful place to stick 10 grand.
Wow.
So why do I think the interest rate is a crude tool? Well, like the housing market's already decimated, right? It got hammered pretty good already. It's one of the first ones it does. And you, again, they only have one interest rate they can change. The tech sector is beginning to get affected because arguably we overhired during the pandemic, and that probably happened. I think you're going to see more layoffs in the new year. I think you're going to see them across the board in the new year. That's what I think. I don't know that for sure. And then the other thing with the interest rates, they take a long time to take effect, right? They really take 6 to 9 months to have full effect. And we could easily overshoot it and put ourselves into a deeper recession. So that's why I think they're pretty crude. And again, I mentioned, what's that?
Let me ask Amber on that question. Amber, I don't know how many people, I never knew about Vortex till I met you. I had no idea we had this great company out in Mount Horeb or out that way. And I had to run up for a minute. I don't know how many people you guys employ, but have they had to lay off people because of the supply chain stuff and just the economy?
So Vortex is about 350 employees. We are in Barneveld, Wisconsin. formerly in Middleton, and then they built the campus in Barneveld. So because of all the inventory that we have and all the cash flow that is being held up right now, again, across the entire retail industry, Vortex also is feeling that. And while we don't anticipate layoffs anytime soon, they have implemented a hiring freeze and a wage freeze and reduced non-essential perks and benefits. So I'm gonna kind of not go too deep into that, just out of respect for the company. But
Right,
yes, the hiring freeze is common knowledge. Where we were hiring very quickly, even during the pandemic, they just halted it completely. So hopefully not layoffs in the near future, but I would not be shocked.
Yeah.
Amber, while you're talking about Vortex, would you encourage us to take any of us to come out there for a little trip to visit the headquarters and maybe bring a pair of your binoculars and have you guys talk about your products? It seems like it would be a fun side trip.
Absolutely. In fact, we have had, and I'm not like the coordinator for this, but I do know that we get plenty of groups of all types that will schedule and come out. We do tours of the facility. We have an entire showroom where you can try out all of our binoculars and products and scopes, even shop the apparel. And we do have the range that you can also sign up to take a course or learn more about. But yes, they do they do bring in groups. And, I would highly encourage this group to go check it out. It's a beautiful facility with a beautiful nature conservation surrounding it. Highly worth the trip.
It's always amazing to me, even after being city editor at the State Journal for 5 years, just not knowing all these little businesses. I'm not little even businesses out there do this, and amazingly international.
Yeah, they're one of the premier scope and
Yes.
binocular makers in the world. They
So
probably
birders must love you.
Loophole is not a fan of us, I'll tell you that. If you know Loophole, they are a well-known optic company, and we're not friends.
Okay, Kurt.
So I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I'm gonna go back to this a little. But so I thought I'd hit a couple more things. So I'm gonna hit kind of the things that I've been watching and some esoteric numbers, and hopefully can explain them and what the hell they mean a little bit. But and you guys are seeing my screen, right?
Yes.
Correct? Yeah, okay. So you should see personal savings rates. So you can see during the pandemic, so I probably can,
I love this chart, by the way.
I have it zoomed out right now, but if I come in, I mean, you can see this, the effect of not going out, not doing stuff, and then some of the stimulus money, people just stashed it.
Well, I would even argue, look, if you go back to 2008 and show that little blip, we all remember 2008. I had just entered the workforce then. And that personal savings blip right there is nothing compared to that 2020.
Wow.
That's how impactful it was, and how impactful it was on the supply chain.
Wow.
So I'll argue that's partially why we haven't seen a drop in demand a lot. I mean, we got to flush out a lot of that excess cash, and that sounds awful, but people are using it. They're actually using it. They're burning up their savings to cover their living expenses again, especially at the bottom end of the earning cycle of the earners. So, but I find it interesting. So why do I think we're gonna, what are there's a bunch of numbers that I watch, but I'm going to share 3 of them that are maybe a little esoteric, but kind of interesting. So
what's that one crazy index you look at from Baltic or something?
I'll hit that.
That one's a fun one too.
Yeah, we'll hit that one. But the first one is and it's happened before every recession. The bond yield. So think of this as the number of years a bond, that bond's held. So first of all, I got to probably hit what bond yield is versus, let me see, I'm bring that up so I don't forget what my slides are. First of all, yield versus interest, right? Interest is what the Fed sets the bonds at, and then yield is what people pay as a discounted value because they either want to buy them that are already started, or they want to divest of it. So I could go deeper into that, but we're just going to follow yield, which is actually what you're getting paid for that bond over time. Typically, this is what it looks like. So a 2-year, just think of a 2-year bond and a 10-year bond, because that's what primarily gets compared. Somebody learned that this happens before every recession. So the Fed can affect the 2-year bond. So first of all, the reason you're not getting paid as much money on a bond that's not held very long is you're not locking up your money. You can take it back out and invest in something else very, very quickly. Where a 10-year bond, it's kind of a commitment. Now you can sell it again, but you're going to sell it at a discount. So this is a typical, so this locks your money up. This is a typical yield curve. But what happens what happens is it flattens and sometimes even gets inverted. So you guys probably heard of an inverted yield curve. So this is my understanding of an inverted yield curve. So again, the Fed can affect this part because they set the interest rates, but they have almost no impact, almost zero impact on the 10-year. That's just the market. So what happens when it actually goes inverted, and I don't have a picture of that, then the yield on the 10-year minus the 2 is much higher than the yield on the 2-year is much higher than the 10-year, so it goes inverted. Well, so checking that this morning, this is live data. So there's the yield for the 2-year, and there's the yield for the 10-year.
Read them for me. They're too small.
They're too small. All right. The yields are. I wish I could make it bigger, but the yield on the 2-year is 4.51%, and the yield on a 10-year is 3.77. That in a normal cycle should not happen. It happens, and then it usually reverses. But if it stays that way for several months, then which it actually has. So this is a 10-year minus the 2-year. So it went negative.
Wow.
It actually went negative in July, and it stayed negative.
Wow.
And so just to be clear, so if I expand this and I go back, let me just go back to see how far back I can go. There's 1981. So there's the 90s recession. There's the 2000 recession. Yeah. So and there's the and then there's the 2008, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this happens, if you notice, that happened in 2006. So it's a leading indicator. It happens when people start pulling back. And why does it happen? Investors are expecting the economy is going to soften and interest rates will come down because that's what the Fed does. So they secure longer term rates. The other thing is they rush into long-term investments because it's safer. It's a nice, safe investment. Or alternatively, they think, other things like the stock market are going to perform poorly, which they do in a downturn of an economy. So hopefully so people probably have heard of inverted yield curve. There's a little more to it, but that's basically it. The other one that I watched that I think is interesting is it's referred to as the Baltic Dry Index. And I thought it was because of the Baltic Sea. This is this is an index of the price to ship goods. And I thought the Baltic Sea, why does it have that? Well, it's actually the Baltic Exchange in London puts this out.
Oh.
So what it is it's the average price paid for shipping on more than 20 shipping routes around the globe. And it's all bulk goods. So it's only bulk goods. So think grains, coal, iron ore, cotton, cement, even sugar. That's what they're carrying. And these ships are massive. So So one of the things about that's unique about it is when there's a high demand, you can't add more ships very quickly. So the supply stays constant there. And, they, in theory, you would think they could pull them off the ocean when the demand is low, right? And just use less of them. The problem is they're so massive and so expensive to run, they have to run. So supply stays almost entirely constant. So it's a lead, and because these are raw goods, typically, it's got a long lead time. So it's really what happens prior to what is going to happen in the economy, because these are the guys. If it's steel, that's going to get made into a finished good in a manufacturer, 6 months from now.
So what's the big bulge there?
This is the mid part of this year. That's 2021, right? And so interesting. So this one I was trying to figure out, which is September, which is, yeah. So this is a 3 months index. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit and
Go to 6 months.
Yeah, I'll see.
Because then I can
there we
tag
go.
on.
All right. And I did not know what the September thing was, right? I really didn't. And Amber had a pretty good
But I do.
reason. Yeah.
What is it? What is it?
So let's go back to last May, about 6-7 months ago. And by then we were still seeing huge amounts of finished goods coming into the country or globally. And that was right about the time when the biggest retailers were seeing that their inventory was getting too high. We'd had tons of stuff coming in, great, trying to hit demand, all that. By May, June, companies were saying, oh, shoot, like, halt, we can't be bringing in any more inventory. So,
they shoot.
huh?
I bet they didn't say shoot.
You'd be surprised what we say in those meetings.
I know, that's what I mean.
Yeah. So that happened in May and June. So as you see the graph lines going down and hitting an all-time low in September, that's when the retailers said, stop the shipments, we can't bring any more in. That lead time is about 3 months out. So decisions were made in May, June. By September, that product had been halted and wasn't going to be coming on ships. So that's where you're seeing it bottom out in September. Wow. Now, as we come up into like October and such, we're seeing it grow a little bit. That's for like your holiday shipments, your Black Friday. And I'm only really talking about the US, but that's your Q4 shipments. And what we're probably going to see is that bottom back out probably by January. I would be shocked if it wasn't bottomed out again.
So yeah, so if I zoom out a little bit here, I can zoom out out to a 5-year, and it gets, hopefully that worked or not. Maybe it's not going to let me do that.
Nope, it is.
Is it? Okay.
Yep, you were. Yep.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
You're
cool.
Good.
Actually, I wanted to get 2008 in here too.
So you want to?
Ooh, yeah.
2008, right? So there's 2007, and there's
bottomed out.
It just
Oh
craters.
my God.
And I can say, I remember back then too, is retailers were seeing a ton of inventory, and maybe most of you remember that prices plummeted. Like companies were just trying to slash and burn prices to move that inventory because we were facing that recession.
Wow.
And I hate to say it, but the indicators would kind of show right now we're might be headed that direction.
And then
How hard it'll be, I don't know, but.
And I thought we'd turn to our labor force and what's going on there a little bit. But a little context of it is that I want to hit is this is interesting to me. I learned this a while back, but just what part of the GDP is contributed by labor, and you can see it. You can see it, it's been slowly decreasing since the 1950s, right? 1950s and 1990s. And then you see when tech got involved. So it's down to 56% of our GDP is produced by labor. The rest is is investments or automation or
So you mean we're not making anything? People are not actually.
the contributions of individuals to producing something has significantly decreased as we've automated more, as we've
So it's robots. It's
yeah.
wow. Only 56. No wonder.
So if you think about it, if you're a general laborer and that's what you have to contribute and raise your money to live on, you became much. I mean, this is partly also why up until this point, labor unions were kind of exiting. So I just think it's interesting. It's just it's a thing to keep in mind. I just pulled my little graph out. Damn it. All right. This is the other one I just heard on NPR the other day, which is interesting. So as people have exited the workforce and because of all this disruption that's going on, our labor productivity, which is measured on hours worked against GDP, has dropped the most it's ever dropped. So our productivity's gone down significantly, which is, I don't know if it's going to stay there, but that's all in this. I believe all in this disruption space.
Well, Kurt, that big drop coincides with you retiring, doesn't it?
It does. So, what happened to our labor force, right? 1.65 million people dropped out of our labor force. And haven't come back. Now, what's the reason for it? I mean, I've heard some people from the far right explain, well, it's because we gave everybody a bunch of money. Well, I don't buy that. I really don't. But there's childcare access. People are rethinking their working arrangement, right? One of the articles I either read or listened to referred to as whiplash, right? Prior to, during the pandemic, people got let go. And then now we don't have enough people to fill a job. So it's, and people recognized when they got let go, they're like, well, what's the loyalty here? Why should, and they rethink what they were doing, kind of what he was talking about.
Amber, let me ask Amber, how far do people drive to come to Barneveld? Any idea?
Oh, yes. So quite a few drive 40 minutes plus to get there.
Really?
I can say that Vortex is an amazing place to work, and they are so good to their employees. Employee retention is really, really high. Even when we were hiring, it was not uncommon to see hundreds and hundreds of resumes just for one position. So people are willing to drive for it.
When you're calculating labor productivity, how does automation play in? In other words, you had 10 people, but now you've got 3 people, but
yes,
the automation is taking care of what
that will cause GDP to drop. Yep. Yeah. Or that will cause the portion done by labor against the GDP to go way down. So that's partly what's going on.
So then we shouldn't be as alarmed by labor productivity going down, because automation is picking up
some of that is true, but this is a massive drop in one little chunk of time. So I don't know what's going to happen, right? I mean, I'm just posing the question.
Here's the story for you. I was up in Hewitt, Minnesota, way up north, almost into Canada, about 2 years ago, visiting family. There's a guy who has a little factory that he makes things like the plastics that go around a taser. It's all plastics things. Small town. And he had maybe like 60 employees. Well, every time there was a downturn, he had to lay off some employees. Well, this means people that his kids go to school with, and they see at church, they see at school. He just could not take the pressure of laying off people in this little town that he knew. So he got 2 robots to help him. And they got them installed, and they make the little plastic things that everything they do from flashlights, like I say, to tasers, because it's not that he couldn't employ them, but when it was down, he had to lay them off or let them go, and he couldn't handle that type of pressure in a little town. So Now he's got a robot that takes care of that. Now those guys permanently are out of jobs, but he doesn't have to constantly, deal with it. It's an interesting phenomenon to watch and think about. I mean, Vortex, do you have robots?
Yeah, we definitely have robotic equipment. I don't know how well I can speak to them though.
That's maybe a little out of your.
Yeah, that's outside the scope of t-shirts and hoodies.
Yeah, but anyway, that's interesting to think about and how that happens and all the pressures on these things. Besides just, hey, at John Deere or at Amazon, they have it now. The computers will pull it out and package it, and they can identify 2,000 different things as they do it with a computer. So my brother-in-law, who used to pull parts at John Deere, retired and was replaced by a computer that can just scoot around and pick up everything and put it in and be done.
So there are a significant amount of jobs created that are maintaining this stuff or programming it or setting it up. There's a lot of jobs there. The problem is training, right? I mean, my belief is we do have to do at least get tech schools or 2-year schools at least covered.
A lot of retraining.
I mean, it's not retraining and training, because there's no way in heck you can do this just with your.
Well, and one of the things, Kurt, you always talk about is in the agriculture, the Industrial Revolution basically happened, and people came off the farms and they're doing what they used to sort of do as a farm. I mean, it was labor. Yep. It was hand labor doing something.
It was an easy retrain, but that's not the case now.
And that's not now, because again, this is a huge change.
So you see that anyway. You see the civilian labor force, right? The number of people. This is the number of people available to work. So basically, you're over 16, you're under 65, I think is where they stop, and then it does not count the people that have just left the labor force. But I'm going to zoom in, and you can just see it crater, and it's coming back. It's coming back, but it's still. And so this is labor force participation. So of those jobs, of those people that are available to work, here's the number of people that are working. So that again cratered, and it's starting to come back, but there's like 1.5% of our labor force that's not working yet.
Kurt, remind people where they could find the Fred stuff.
Oh yeah, I mean, you could Google it. You can Google these things, but Fred is Federal Reserve economic data. It's housed at St. Louis, right? I used to take days to put this stuff together, and this stuff you can just Google it and find it. The problem is sometimes I look at it and I can't read it quite right. So the Great Resignation, the Great Reshuffling, I think we're seeing. I mean, this is going to go on for the rest of my life for sure. Is where people end up, right? But he talked about quiet quitting. I've seen that happen, and because I'm still tied to the organization that I started. Amber, you got an example of this, right? If you're willing to share it.
Sorry, I was just answering a question on the chat.
Gotcha.
I like your answer.
You got an example of kind of reshuffling and you're rethinking.
Oh, in terms of labor?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll speak to that a little bit. So I don't consider myself as part of the Great Resignation, but I would call myself part of the Great Reassessment, in that instead of just quitting, or this new term quiet quitting that we've all heard of, I was already starting a small business, and I decided that I would exit the labor force within a couple of years, and I planned for that. So I'm going to be exiting the labor force, and just.
But you accelerated your thoughts on that, right?
I would definitely say I accelerated, everything, the plans and everything to do that, and that was with the pandemic. It forced me to reassess and think, how quickly can I exit? And it was nothing to do necessarily. I'm not one of those that hated being a part of the labor force. I really enjoyed my career and even my job. But I guess I was looking for one, to run my business, and that's what I wanted to do, and more flexibility in my own life. So,
Amber, without, if you don't want to answer it, don't answer it. But I'm curious about your cohorts. You're definitely younger than Kurt. You're definitely younger than me, and you're definitely younger than Dennis. So I'm just curious, in your cohort, if you're in your 30s or whatever you are, do you see this with other people?
I do. And I don't think that the people my age and younger are necessarily looking to just leave the workforce, but they are reassessing what's important to them. And so I've had chats with my coworkers, some of them that are Gen X and have a different viewpoint than the Gen Z. Millennials are kind of in the middle of both. But in my age and younger, some of us have been through 2000. We entered the workforce during the last recession, and that was not a good experience for us. And now as we're coming upon potentially another one of those, we're deciding, the job is not my identity anymore. And I want more flexibility to have a life. I'll still work. I'm happy to work. But I need employers, and other people do too. They want flexibility. That's that whole work-life balance, but it's even people on the front lines could be given more flexibility in their day-to-day lives rather than relying on that 40 hours a week time clock. We don't have to work that much anymore.
It's interesting to me when my daughter moved out to Seattle and Tacoma. She went out to college there and she stayed, and we went out to visit and met the friends that they met. She and her husband met, and I would say to them, what do you do? And their answer would be, I hike, I bike, I climb rocks, that. And if you ask that, I would argue if I'd asked that question at a party in Madison, somebody would say, I work at Epic, I work at the university, I work government. And out there on the West Coast, they say what their I won't say avocation, but what they really do, how they identify themselves is not with their employer, it's with what they do.
You nailed it. That is exactly what's happening.
Yeah. So the comment that I heard on the NPR article I was just listening to is the relationship between employer and employee is broken, right? It's changed. It's going to continue to change. And how that lends, I don't know. But it's an interesting thing to discuss.
So the other, wrap us up here.
Yeah. So I was going to hit crypto, but I don't think we're going to do that today because we're running out of time. But hopefully this was useful. The last slide that I've got, or last data set I've got is the quits report, right? It's referred to as a JOLTS report, which is job openings and labor turnover, which is the basically quits level. And then how many people are quitting and moving into something else. And it really tanked there because everybody was figuring out what the hell they were going to do. And now it's starting to level off, but it's leveling off at a much higher rate.
Oh my God, look at that.
Than we've ever seen. So I just think it's interesting data, interesting information. Was this useful to everybody? I hope.
Well, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. Dennis, what do you think? You're the master of the whole place. What did we do here?
No, I thought this was very interesting, and it was great having Amber as part of the conversation. That whole perspective really is very valuable. So the kind of dog and pony with I'm not going to go forget that. Having both Kurt and Amber.
Well, Dennis,
worked out really well.
Are you going to buy a pie from Amber? That's what I want to know.
Oh,
yeah. How do I do that?
How do we buy pies?
Well, you can check out our website. We are Sunnyside Down, ssdfarm.com. I'll put it in the chat. I am at capacity for pies this week, so I can't do any more.
Hey, Amber, can you take a question at the very end?
Mm-hmm.
Can you see that one about parenting young children? Do you have kids? I mean, you're switching around all this. Are you balancing kids?
I am not. I'm not married, and I do not have children. I am
how would
small
you
business.
How'd you answer
Oh, I'll be honest, I'm probably not the best one to answer that. I don't have experience. I suppose my sister does in how she balanced her kids and things, but that's a tougher one. That's a conversation for next time.
Well, I can tell you this, after just getting back from Tacoma, Washington, in 2 weeks, taking care of 4-year-old twins because of illnesses and COVID. And this is not the first time I've been out there. I've been out there 5 or 6 times, one time as many as 6 weeks because of illnesses and COVID. My 2 kids are working from home. My kids and my daughter and her husband can work from home, and they're upstairs in bedrooms, and I'm running around with twins, and they're lucky to have grandparents who can come out and spend that time. It's an issue, big issue.
Well, I can keep talking, but I think this.
All right, Dennis.
Right?
Dennis, it's up to
What do you
you to
think?
say goodbye for the whole season, Dennis.
Yeah, right. Yeah, this has been another good series of discussions with people, and been getting some very kind words in terms of the reaction. So yeah, thanks everybody, and happy Thanksgiving.
See you. I'll see you turkeys next season.
All right.
Bye-bye.